Okay. We'll call the meeting to order. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mayor Richard Stewart. I'm chairing this meeting of Council, and we're going to open this meeting with a formal commemoration of service. You don't get to do this very often, and it's important when we do it, I think, that we acknowledge the service of members of Council. And it gives me great pleasure this evening to formally acknowledge and thank Mr. Neal Nicholson, Councillor Neal Nicholson, as he then was, for his years of service to the community as a long-serving member of Coquitlam City Council. First elected to City Council in 2007, Neal served as an important part of our City Council for a total of 7 years. While on Council, Neal sat on a number of committees and advisory committees as both Chair and Vice Chair, most noticeably in the arts, heritage, and culture. In addition to representing our residents at this Council table, Neal represented the City of Coquitlam's interest regionally at Metro Vancouver. His interest in culture and heritage, as well as environmental sustainability, were evident in the causes he championed. And as a chartered accountant, Neal was especially passionate about the need for the city to be fiscally responsible to its stakeholders, and his financial background was of great value to our residents and occasionally to his fellow council members who he was able to advise on what bookkeeping meant. I'm sure my council colleagues will also acknowledge that it was always interesting as we debated various topics when Neal weighed in on an issue. It was usually begun with a long pause and then some very wise words. His approach was deliberate and his input was always carefully considered. Neal continues to be active in the community, serving as a current member of the city's Culture Services Advisory Committee, as well as a board member of the Douglas College Foundation, treasurer for the board of the Rivershed Society of BC, as well as volunteering with the Coquitlam Heritage Society. So tonight we're going to honor him with small gifts, including his name tag from here in Council Chambers, but also for the first time we're going to be acknowledging outgoing council members with a contribution to the Coquitlam Foundation in such a way that we will be able to ensure that the legacy of their work is represented in a small way perhaps, but nonetheless represented at that level. And I'd invite Councillor O'Neil, who's our City Council rep, or the Mayor's rep on the Coquitlam Foundation, to say a few words about that one element.
Thank you very much. Yes, at the beginning of the year, the Coquitlam Foundation established the 125 Legacy Fund in commemoration of the 125th anniversary of the City of Coquitlam. This Legacy Fund was designed to support projects that build the legacy of Coquitlam, art projects or design projects, or we have a long list of criteria. And the fund is growing. We're very close to announcing a major contribution. We already have several $1,000s in it, and we had a goal of $125,000 for the 125th anniversary. So I'm really pleased when I learned that the city was proposing that donations be made on behalf of honored councillors to the 125 Legacy Fund, and I'm super pleased that Councillor Nicholson, former Councillor Nicholson, my friend Neal, has agreed with this donation. It means a lot to the community. Of course, Neal means a lot to the community. So it's much appreciated.
Thank you for that. O'Neil on behalf of Neal. And now on behalf of City Council and our whole community, please join me in applauding Neal as I invite him to come forward to receive a gift in appreciation for his years of service to the City of Coquitlam. carefully your tie.
And now that my daughter's got her phone.
Got it? Okay.
If you don't mind, I'll say a few words.
Yeah, I'll invite you to in just a moment.
Okay.
So as is our custom, we'd like to invite you to say a few words. And as is also our custom, go ahead.
Those rules apply to people who ask to be delegations, Your Worship. I was invited here. I'm not a councillor, and you're really not in control. So I'll explain the long pause. The long pause is because I always expected that my fellow councillors were still digesting the things that my previous speakers had said and wanted to capture every bit of it. And I also wanted to make sure that they were really listening. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is one of the few events that I've been at in the city this year that is not a sanctioned 125 event. It is, however, by my proclamation, a 4-0 event. It was 1976 when Barbara and I, with a 2-year-old and a newborn, came to live in Ranch Park. And now there are 9 in all, many of them here tonight. And I won't name our children and their partners, but we have Benjamin, David, we have Felix, who's not here tonight, and Christopher Neal. You can all look forward to hearing more from later. Councillor O'Neill and the Mayor both referred to heritage as one of my keen interests. And I need to point out to you that I am wearing the suit that I wore to my first inauguration. One of the significant things about that was that I learned for the first time how much you can rely on staff. As I sat at the table in the other room, right next to Warren Jones, the then city manager, I put my hand up to ask Maxine to let me speak. And I felt Warren's hand go into my, I thought that's a little personal. Yeah, and he, like that, put the tag from my suit down on the table in front of me. So I truly know that staff has your back whenever you serve on this council. The other piece of heritage that I brought along was when I put the suit on, I got out my Expo 86 tie to go with it. And I might be willing to give that to the archives at some point. Coquitlam's changed a whole lot in the 40 years that we've been here. And a lot of it because of decisions that were made right here. Sometimes when I was here and sometimes when I wasn't. A lot of things got built trying to meet people's needs as they expressed them to us. I'm really proud of the decisions that I was part of here and the results of them. The most significant one for me was when my colleagues and I agreed that we should support the hiring of an archivist and the preservation of our city's archives as a start to knowing who we are and where we came from. We did it, and our feeling was, I believe at the time, pretty common, that we will do it because we ought to do it. We're not really too sure about it. I mean, who would be interested? Why would you do that? But other cities are doing it, and we're a city, and we should do this. And it was less than a year later that the archivist made her first presentation in this council chamber to way more people than are here tonight. The house was full. The community interest and the community determination to access the archives to learn about our history and where we came from and what it meant as to where we were going was far beyond our expectations. Anybody who knows me knows where we're going here. We're the largest city in British Columbia without a heritage center or a museum or a hospital, Your Worship. We need to know where we've been and where we've come from to know where we're going. We need to preserve our heritage now or we will lose it forever. I'm asking you to honor it by preserving it, housing it where it can be shared. Thank you for your recognition. Thank you for your gift. Most of all, thank you for listening. I will be seeing you.
You have 12 seconds left. You don't want them? Well, it is true that you had a tremendous amount to do with a great many decisions that moved Coquitlam forward. On behalf of Council, once again, thank you and best wishes from all of us. Miss? Wait a minute, you're leaving? There we go. Well done.
Second item. Item 2 concerns the minutes of the public hearing held on Monday, October 3rd. Recommendation to approve.
Moved by Councillor Marsden, second by Councillor O'Neill. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 3 is the minutes of the regular council meeting held on Monday, October 3rd. Recommendation to approve.
Moved by Councillor Marsden, second by Councillor Towner. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 4 is minutes of the Maillardville Commercial and Cultural Revitalization Advisory Committee meeting of Thursday, June 23rd. Recommendation to receive.
Moved by Councillor Wilson, the chair, second by Councillor Hodge, vice chair. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 5 is minutes of the Cultural Services Advisory Committee meeting of Thursday, September 8th. Recommendation to receive.
Moved by the chair, Councillor O'Neill, second by the vice chair, Councillor Towner. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item of business arising out of that committee's meeting concerns the Kaleidoscope Festival, debrief, and feedback. Committee recommendations that Council consider holding the Kaleidoscope Arts and Culture Festival on an annual basis.
Motion is to receive. We may want to have staff review that, and I suspect a motion to refer to staff would have been just as in order. This is fine too. That motion is from Councillor O'Neill, seconded by Councillor Towner. To receive. Second. Anything further? All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 6 pertains to the Multiculturalism Advisory Committee meeting of Wednesday, September 14th. Recommendation to receive.
Moved by Councillor Asmundson, the chair, second by Vice Chair Councillor O'Neill. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Oops, Councillor Zerillo, my apologies.
I just wanted to point out on page 4 of the minutes, the very bottom item, that it was noted that the Moon Festival scheduled for Saturday, September 17th was canceled due to anticipated heavy rains. And it just highlights the need for cross-pollination of our committees, because wasn't that the day of our picnic as well? Our heritage picnic on the 17th.
Yes.
So if we had known. Anyway, I just wanted to point it out. I thought it was very interesting that they had anticipated the rain on the Multicultural Advisory Committee.
And
I thought that was very cool.
And as one who showed up with Councillor O'Neill at the site of our flooding, our very soggy picnic, I'm glad we did cancel that event. It was a little bit miserable that day.
That's all.
Okay. That was moved. Yep. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 7 is the minutes of the Sports Council meeting held on Wednesday, September 14th. Recommendation to receive.
Moved by Chair Councillor Hodge, second by Vice Chair Councillor Towner. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 8 is fourth and final reading of Bylaw Notice Enforcement Amendment Bylaw number 4717. Staff recommendation is that Council give fourth and final reading to Bylaw Notice Enforcement Amendment Bylaw number 4717.
Moved by Councillor Marsden, second by Councillor O'Neill. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 9 is our first report of staff, and it concerns an updated regional affordable housing strategy. Staff recommendations that Council endorse in principle the Metro Vancouver Regional Affordable Housing Strategy, on the understanding that Coquitlam has its own housing affordability strategy that has been developed to specifically respond to Coquitlam's local housing affordability challenges. And 2, direct staff to send a letter that contains council feedback on this item and attaches this report to Metro Vancouver as Coquitlam's response to Metro's request for endorsement of the Regional Affordable Housing Strategy.
Moved by Councillor Asmussen, seconded by Councillor Marsden. Councillor O'Neill.
Yes, thank you very much. Got a few points and questions. Maybe the representative on the from council here on Housing Committee might have some answers as well. First off, I do want to say that I'm really pleased that Metro Vancouver took our concerns to heart and changed that language from an attempt to require the city to do something to these suggestions, which I forget the exact words, but that's the main focus now is.
Now municipalities will consider.
Thank you very much.
Plans, policies, and programs.
That's right. So I think that's good because we have already done that anyway, to a great degree. Now, the affordable housing strategy at the metro level says two things, and I want to relate them to issues here in Coquitlam. One is the local government's chief role lies in ensuring an adequate supply of residential land to meet housing demand through the land use planning and regulatory process. So it says that's our chief role, and I just really want to underline that for us going forward. I think that's a subject that comes up, especially in the city of Vancouver, where there's real concerns about not moving forward with densification there to provide this sort of housing. So I think that's an important thing. Now, throughout the report, Metro's report, on its own housing policy, they also have sections that say proposed provincial government actions, which of course aren't Metro's policy, but are requests to the province to look at stuff. And I'm wondering why, given that they're going beyond having their own policy and into the area of requesting the provincial government look into the impact or look into certain projects or certain policies, they didn't look at a couple of things. Maybe there's somebody from Metro or could speak to this. The mayor, I'm hoping, maybe has the answers. One of them, and this is attempting to put together little pods of information that we have. If the really big issue that we're hearing more and more, and we heard it, I think, from the mayor in an email about some new statistics that Coquitlam's going to be expected to have 5,000 new rental units in the next decade or 2 decades or something like that. And that's a Metro Vancouver projection. That why doesn't Metro look at asking the provincial government for something that we all seem to take for granted, but which could have a major effect on the provision of rental housing, and that's the fact that the provincial government has rent controls in place in the province. That landlords are allowed to raise their rents in a given year only by a certain amount, regardless of what big expenses they may or may not have had. And I've always been curious about what impact that would have on somebody's decision, a prospective developer's decision, to build a rental building, knowing that he or she might be constrained in the future from raising rents significantly enough to support the ongoing maintenance of the building. You don't have to answer, Mr. Mayor, if you don't, but if you know the answer, has this ever come up at Metro? Did they talk about that? Are they curious about it? Do we know?
Okay, so I'm chair of the Regional Planning Committee and a member, I was last year's chair of the Housing Committee. And no, we typically don't have conversations about rent control. I don't know that the rent control has ever, I don't remember having been party to a discussion at Metro Vancouver about that. There's no question that among the challenges that the landlord community cites is that they're allowed to lose as much money as they want in when times are such that, for example, Calgary landlords are now cutting their rents because vacancy rate has gone so high because so many tenants moved out at the. So if you lower your rents, though, at some point you won't be able to increase them back, and that has always been a challenge that landlords have cited. For example, we as a landlord at one point lowered our rent for a family that was living in our unit, and found ourselves unable to raise it back to what it was, because that's the challenge associated with it. It is at the same time the unconscionable rent increase that was meant to be prevented by provincial legislation. The provincial legislation actually aimed at the unconscionable rent increase. We all agree that that's probably one that we want as a society to forestall, but unfortunately the current policy doesn't only address the unconscionable rent increase. It addresses rent increases generally, and that it can be a challenge in trying to produce the 5,000 that we're expected to produce over the next decade.
Yeah, and that's my thought too, but I don't really know. And nobody's asking the provincial government to look into it. The Metro Vancouver didn't do a study of that itself. I don't see much written about it, but we seem to accept all of these policies and not look at the consequences. In the other major policy, and I'm not saying that we should get rid of this either, but I'd like to know the impact. In Metro Vancouver, there's over 60,000 hectares of agricultural land reserved land. This is land that, for very good reasons, in the most part, has been protected for agricultural use, and by a provincial legislation. And I raised this question at a Metro meeting at least a year ago, and asking if they were considering, have they ever looked into the impact of having all this agricultural land that can't be developed, what the impact is on affordability. I mean, you look at the number one reason, maybe it's not number one, one of the prime reasons is that we have high land values here. We've got mountains to the north, ocean to the west, the border to the south, and everything to the east. So much of it's agricultural land. It's not even east of Metro. It's inside of Metro, over 60,000 hectares of agricultural land. And is nobody curious about what impact this might have or does have on housing prices? I'm curious. I'd like to know. It's another one of these things that we seem to accept without questioning, but I think we should look at these things. When we're in a crisis of housing affordability, as we are now, we should know all the impacts, and all we've been focusing on is foreign ownership, but there's a lot of things that we've done ourselves that we have to look at. And so, has that ever, I raised it at Metro Council meetings, and I got a negative answer. Since then, have you heard anything, Mr. Mayor, about anybody looking at this or concerned about it or wanting to evaluate it?
Not since then. I don't know that there has been that discussion, because at the same time, there hasn't been a lot of discussion at the Metro level to eliminate parks and to develop them, or to develop industrial land for residential or whatever. We have, as a society, decided that some land is protected as parkland, some as sensitive, environmentally sensitive land, some as agricultural land, some for industrial purposes, and some for institutional purposes. There's no question that there's no shortage of housing in the Greater Vancouver. There's a shortage of land that can accommodate housing, and therefore we as members of Metro Vancouver, as communities, we have to start looking at more efficient use of land, and that means density. It doesn't necessarily mean, because it really is a choice between density and sprawl in most cases, and we have decided on a compact region, and that certain types of land, including parkland, environmentally sensitive land, agricultural land, and industrial land, needs to be protected for the purposes of the livable community that we're trying to create.
Yeah, and I don't ever.
Councillor Reid has one thing that she wants to add to that element.
Well, I was going to say that
In response to
me or
your
to you?
question, because she was on the Housing Committee when it was addressed.
Thank you.
Councillor Reid.
We have talked about all of that at Metro, and the most important thing and the biggest thing that we need to do is we need to have the federal government participate like they did 25 years ago in programs that gave tax incentives to builders to build affordable housing. And that is it. That is the biggest thing we can do. I can tell you horror stories, and we've had some at Metro about rent, you know, the rentalsmen and all the stuff that happens there, and it can be not so pretty. Landlords are always seen to be the ones that take advantage, but there's lots of tenants that take advantage too. Mm-hmm. So the biggest thing that we should be pushing for, every city in this province should be after the feds. It will cost them nothing, but they can give out whatever it used to be. They gave out tax incentives, they put special programs.
Almost all tax credit based.
Yeah, tax credit basis, and that's what we need to do. And then you get people that will start building this stuff. And then, Terry, it also comes in at a price that can keep affordable rentals. Because right now to build, there's no such thing as an affordable apartment right now. You just can't build one. The rents are going to be so high. But with those tax incentives, and that would be something maybe you want to work on, because boy, that is the answer.
Thank you for those answers. And speaking of rental, I have one last point, and it's a question to staff. The Metro Vancouver report says the main focus of the regional affordable housing strategy is on rental housing. And I think we'd all agree that that's really where the big crunch is coming. In the City of Coquitlam's housing affordability strategy, we have all sorts of policies that do try to provide incentives to develop purpose-built market rental housing units. But quite recently, we did something kind of on an ad hoc basis, but that actually was part of something that staff was going to be working on, and that's of our housing affordability strategy, objective 1.2.3 is to review the zoning bylaw and consider amendments that support purpose-built rental unit development, such as off-street parking and common amenity space reductions. By the way, exactly the two issues that came up on the Charland thing. So based on local neighborhood and market context, vehicle ownership data, and transit service levels. This specific review is supposed to be a short-term, high-priority A item. And I know we've dealt with this, on the ad hoc basis with the Charland development, but I'd like to know from staff where we are on the actual report on reviewing the zoning bylaw for these sorts of amendments. I wonder if anybody on staff has... Mr.
McIntyre.
Yes, thanks, Your Worship, and through the Chair, thanks for that reminder from Councillor O'Neal. It is on our radar, and you're quite correct. There was one application that came forward that sort of brought both those items or criteria in the zoning bylaw to the fore to be dealt with. That was the Charlotte application. We got another one, a very major one right now too, that's challenging, particularly in terms of parking. I've been reminding staff of that. There's a couple of areas that we're working on in the implementation for the housing affordability strategy. And I've also asked that they not lose sight of those two, because we do need some policy direction to enable us to process some development applications that are taking us up on that. That's the good news, is that we've got a number of applications that entirely on their own volition want to include a rental component. And so I think some of the other policy measures that the HAS brought into being have been well received and are in fact motivating developers to include that. So there are some other policy pieces granted around parking for one, and also the amenity provision too, because that might then enable us to get at the more lower end of market rental, perhaps, when you can strip away some of those additional costs. So point taken, and I will remind staff to get on with that.
Thank you. And just final word on that. That's sort of a policy, and proposed amendments would relieve us of the necessity to have to go over these one-time discussions. And the discussion over Charlene was pretty interesting, I'll say. And with the bylaw in place, it would probably make it easier. So thank you very much, and thanks for letting me get all of this off my chest. There was a lot of feelings that were welling up reading this report, and I needed to get these out. Thank you.
Okay, and I will let Council know that the reference that Councillor O'Neill was making to the 12,000 and the 5,000 units of rental, for example, comes out of a revision that Metro Vancouver is now processing to the regional growth strategy, the Metro 2040, using what they call updated estimates, but they're actually not updated. They're actually simply revised estimates. The update would mean that we're accounting for the passage of time, and the estimates have changed because of time, but that's not the case. The estimates have changed because the process that they use, the criteria that they use have changed. And the new estimates would have Coquitlam, would have the Tri-Cities accepting a total demand of 22,000 units, of which 22,000 units in the next 10 years, of which 6,300 units were rental. But the Coquitlam portion of that is almost all of those rental, 5,000 units of rental and 12,000 units of non-rental of ownership demand. These are projections. These are not targets. And I say that, and I make it very clear that these are simply projections, predictions of what the demand will be in the next decade. In the next decade, we will have demand for 17,000 units, 5,000 of which are rental. And I say that very clearly because I want you to turn to page 21 of the Regional Affordable Housing Strategy, an issue that I haven't yet raised with staff because I didn't notice it until this weekend, poring over the agenda. On page 21, you'll see in each one of these categories, this is the category Goal 1, which is to expand the supply and diversity of housing to meet a variety of needs. Goal 2, to expand rental supply. Goal 1, each goal is then divided into what Metro Vancouver will do and what municipalities will do, and then what provincial government or other agencies will do, including health authorities. So when you get to the bottom of column 1, municipalities will consider through plans, policies, and programs, and the first bullet, J, municipalities will consider monitoring and reporting on progress toward achievement of Metro 2040 housing demand estimates. Now, how on earth do you achieve estimates? Now, Metro Vancouver has been adamant that these are not targets. These are definitely not targets. These are simply estimated demand. And yet, perhaps it was Freudian in that they then ask how we will achieve those estimates. So I will be raising that back to them because clearly that they didn't mean to be quite as transparent as that. Or sorry, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean to be as transparent as that. But anyway, so these are estimates. Nonetheless, I would suggest they're also the kinds of things that we ought to be using as, these are pretty much targets of what what we have to acknowledge, because there's the way to produce housing affordability is to meet the demand. That's one of the methods, and that you cannot curb the demand by restricting the supply. So the supply has to somehow match the demand, or else prices will go up. And in fact, oversupply in housing would be seen as a good thing, and that's actually what MERB did. What some of the tax credit stuff in the 70s and 80s did was kind of oversupply a little bit the rental market, so that there was vacancy rates. Right now, the vacancy rate of less than 1 is completely unmanageable, particularly for rental families, and it is making finally. It was also placing a lot of pressure on landlords. Some landlords are actually evicting their tenants because their tenants aren't paying enough, and then paying the penalty for having evicted them, and then so we end up with some unconscionable behavior by landlords, as well as some real challenging times for tenants because we have a disconnect between the supply and demand of rental housing. And obviously, if we don't meet these kinds of numbers, then that disconnect will be perpetuated. Okay. Anything else on that? The motion is to receive. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously. Sorry, my apologies. The motion was to endorse in principle. I'll do it again. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 10 pertains to the Metro Vancouver Board and Brief for their meeting of September 23rd. The City's Metro Vancouver Board representatives are available to respond to any questions, and the staff recommendations that Council receive the brief for information.
Moved by Councillor Marsden, seconded by Councillor Zerillo. All in favor?
Councillor Neal has a question.
Oh, you've already asked your question about Metro.
Putting the two things together.
Putting the two together.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I see on page,
Councillor Neal.
thank you very much. I see on page 3 that there's a motion encouraging agricultural production through farm property tax reform in Metro Vancouver. So the Metro Vancouver staff has prepared a white paper on this. And it's basically about the necessity of tax reform to encourage farming on agricultural land in the Metro Vancouver region. So I want to say, as long as there is agricultural land in the Metro Vancouver region, I definitely support encouraging farming on there. So I think that's a good idea. The question is, how much agricultural land should we have in Metro Vancouver, or actually officially the Greater Vancouver Regional District, according to the rest of the report here tonight. So that's the question. If there's going to be agricultural land, and right now we have it, yes, absolutely encourage the farming on it. But I think there really should be serious discussion about how much agricultural land we should have in Metro Vancouver as we get to be a world metropolis, and as we see the increasing concentration, the impact on residential property prices, especially all property prices. I think it's a discussion that we're going to have eventually. But anyway, but as long as we have the agricultural land, farm it.
Well, as chair of the committee that's trying to grapple with this challenge is, for example, the 10-acre land, the 10-acre farm that is being marketed by a realtor right today, that you can build your mansion in the middle of the thing and you can have 10 acres of lawn, and if you have a couple of horses and you do some kind of agriculture, you rent off a small corner, you can also get it at agricultural property tax rates, which is incredibly low rates. So you end up with an estate property where you're paying almost no property taxes. So there's a disincentive to farming.
Not efficient use of land.
It's a horribly inefficient use of land, and so we're trying to tackle that. We're also trying to tackle the provisions that would put, perhaps, instead of the house in the middle of that 10-acre, put the house up against the street and farm 9.5 acres, that sort of thing. There are some challenges, for example, in Richmond, a development application that was something like 27 bedrooms on a sprawling 40,000 square foot, 40,000 square foot single-family home in the middle of a farm, and clearly the farm would never be farmed again, and we would lose it as we have lost so many pieces of property to that kind of inefficient use. So the committee accepts your support and endorsement of their work. We still have a lot of work to do in that regard to try to make it so that our property tax system doesn't reward those that would misuse agricultural land. Councillor Zerillo.
Well, I'm going to take this opportunity, and thank you to Councillor O'Neill for that, but I'm going to take this opportunity just to point out that the price of food, especially fresh food, is really out of control right now, and Councillor Wilson's working on it this week. But Councillor O'Neill said it earlier, we should know all the impacts, and I certainly do always support research, but we should keep in mind that healthy food and fresh food in our community is constantly at risk and out of reach to many of our consumers, has been for a long time. Thanks.
Having just returned from Rotterdam, you'd actually see a farm where the farmhouse is the size of a shed here. It's like several hundred square feet tucked into the corner of a piece of property, and the rest of the property so intensively farmed that it's unbelievable. You're dealing with way more produce coming off a farm in Rotterdam, a 2-acre farm in Rotterdam, that would come off a 20-acre farm in our communities, because they're simply, land is precious. We don't consider land to be precious, and we should. So, and I absolutely agree on that point. Any other discussion related to the board and brief? Seeing none. All in favor of receipt? Opposed? Carried unanimously. Adjournment has been moved by Councillor Asmundson and seconded by Councillor Marsden. All in favor? All opposed? Carried unanimously. I'll acknowledge that Councillor Nicholson mentioned his Expo 86 tie. Expo 86 actually closed 30 years ago this week. That's all I got on that one. Yep. You worked there. Councillor Towner worked there. Okay. Councillor Hodge took pictures there. It's now question period. Oops, we've got Councillor Zerillo. Oops, excuse me, please.
Just wonder if I could just make one. I mentioned today about Breast Cancer Awareness Month in October. We haven't had a good opportunity to talk about it. We've had very many important things on the agenda since the beginning. But one of the things that the Breast Cancer Awareness Month wants to do is talk about action. So I'm going to take this opportunity, that anybody that may be watching, to be diligent about your examinations and make sure that you're proactively managing that. Thank you for indulging me on that. It's just we haven't had a good time this month to talk about it.
Sorry, I didn't count very carefully during the motion to adjourn. I'm going to do that over again. Is there a motion to adjourn? Councillor Asmundson, Councillor Marsden, all in favor, opposed, carried. Otherwise, it wouldn't be on the record. We'll now go to question period. Are there any questions from the audience on tonight's agenda? Any questions? Any questions? Thank you all for coming.